tumble on a sleepless bed, but you're wasting your time trying to lose the blue.
Karl, it's lovely to see you. Welcome to, well, it's your time you're wasting. So we're going to waste a bit of your time. I hope you're well, sir. You're looking well.
Thank you, Mike. It's always great to see you. We've had a great time off air before we've launched, and we do slip into that 50-something Oxonian sense of humour. So I hope we don't, get too hysterical, and the listeners can keep with us. But it's good to see you looking well too.
And how you've been doing a bit of exercise over lockdown, I hear.
Yeah, I'm one of these middle-aged cliche people that got madly into exercise during lockdown, and been doing quite a lot of really triathlon stuff: swimming, cycling, and running, the proper distances, and a bit of strength training as well. And it's been great. I've lost 15, 16 kilos. Feel really good. I was very annoyed with Boris for shutting the gyms this time, but thankfully they're going to open again in a week, so we'll be back on the machines and so on then.
Brilliant. And the triathlon is a sort of interdisciplinary type of sport event, isn't it? I mean, it pulls together three different sports, and does it seem like one? Perhaps, I don't know. But the reason we're talking to you today is the London Interdisciplinary School. Can you tell me a bit about that, please?
Yeah, so I'll skip the triathlon stuff at the moment until I've been more serious about it. But yes, the London Interdisciplinary School is a brand new university. You might have seen the piece in the BBC on the web pages recently about us getting degree awarding powers. And depending how you cut this and describe it, it's genuinely the first kind of startup university to get its own degree awarding powers for many decades, possibly as many as 40, 50 years. And the reason we wanted to do this, as you might know, Martin, I started an undergraduate degree at UCL called the Bachelor of Arts and Sciences, and it was the first BASc, Bachelor of Arts and Sciences, in the UK. So I think there's a story behind that, actually, about how the whole system has seen it appropriate to keep separate the arts and the sciences in its formal thinking about higher education. So we didn't have a BASc until I started one at UCL. Now there are a few others around the country, which is interesting. But of course, trying to start anything interdisciplinary in an existing institution is immensely challenging because the history of the disciplines and the trajectories and the various vested interests of departments makes it very challenging to get that kind of cross-curricular work and thinking going. So when Ed Fido, who's the CEO of the London Interdisciplinary School, approached me, and I'd known Ed from another project we worked on together, another university project, it seemed too good an opportunity to miss. So I jumped out of UCL last March. I've been made a professor, which was very nice of them, really, of interdisciplinary education, or more technically a professorial teaching fellow, because it came up the teaching track. So I'm not a research academic. I'm a kind of teaching innovation and curriculum innovating academic. But I left UCL, that professorship, and joined this brand new enterprise whose mission is to start a brand new university on interdisciplinary lines, because we think there's a big space in the world for us, which doesn't exist certainly in this country yet. And we're developing a very exciting curriculum and all sorts of ideas about porosity with the real world to drive that curriculum and relate to that curriculum. And that's what we're doing. And we're opening next September 21, recruiting at the moment, actively recruiting, and very good interest at the moment too.
You said the word porosity, which I take it is about being porous.
Yes, it's a term due to my colleague. It's not a triathlete term when I'm in the pool or anything. It's a term due to my colleague at UCL, who's a professor of anthropology, Michael Stewart, who wrote a blog on the LSE blog site in 2015, I think, about how he saw universities just becoming too detached from the rest of the world, too ivory towery. Again, it's this kind of circular agenda that they have of being on the research excellence framework, which your listeners may know is about kind of getting research grants and publishing in the best peer-reviewed journals. And that really is the incentive that driving universities. That's what feeds into league tables, which then ironically drives recruitment of students who often don't really see a lot of that high-level research. That's them. They really, what's most important for them is great teaching and great relationships with their teachers and great curricula, which interests the students. But the whole research agenda of universities is very much around kind of looking at each other, often, not entirely, of course. There's a lot going on in universities. It's hard to summarize the whole sector. But Michael's feeling was we needed more porosity. We needed to be talking to the real world about problems out there that businesses, governments, people were dealing with, and thinking about how our academic curricula should relate to that. So LAS is very much in that way of thinking.
Okay, so you mentioned the word cross-curricularity. We've got interdisciplinary as part of the name of the school. Can you tell me, is there a difference between those terms? Are they one and the same?
Yeah, you mentioned cross-curricularity before
Did
we
I?
came on.
I think you said curricularity. Or am I putting words into your mouth, sir?
Well, you did before we met, and I thought that's great. I'll you know, in the attempt to be empathetic, I use that as well. I mean, I'm sympathetic to that term. I mean, I'm where do we start without getting too kind of abstract? I just think the modern world requires us to make a lot of connections across different areas of thought, culture, methods, practice, employment, everything. And it's sort of ironic and almost tragic to me that the last place really thinking about this in detail and sort of in a really rigorous academic and intellectual way is large parts of the British education system. I mean, you can contrast A-levels to IB, for example, in this respect. And A-levels are great, they're fine, but it is the narrowest 16 to 18 education system, I think, in the entire world. I was more up on this a few years ago, and I think Mauritius had a similarly narrow system, but everywhere else has at least five. I think even India, because everyone does English and maths and then 3 subjects, but they inherited a lot from the British anyway. But everywhere else has 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 subjects. So we have typically the only 3, as you know, and then we have single honours degrees, typically, with a few joint honours, which are basically half a degree each. And this is so ironic when you think of the kind of requirements in employment. So one of the stats I roll out very often, just did it last night at a school presentation, is research from the Institute of Student Employers, the main research body who look at graduate employment in this country. And their latest research shows that 86% of all graduate employers, so virtually 9 out of 10, don't care, that's using their words, what degree discipline you studied at university. So it's irrelevant. You can go work for Pfizer with a French history degree. You can go and work for Deutsche Bank with a biochemistry degree. And this shows, if nothing else, that the necessary connection between a single discipline and the world of work is more or less completely broken. And that's been increasing since the mid-thousands, when it was about 63% of employers. It's been going up steadily for 10 years. And this just kind of shows that this, which we all intuitively feel anyway, the connectivity of the modern world of ideas, of people, of enterprises, requires younger people to think across these sort of subject boundaries, the humanities and the science, the qualitative and the quantitative. And anything really, for me, any curriculum that thinks about that sensibly and carefully and creatively is going to add something of value to a young person's education. Of course, it can be done very badly. And if I'm being, very modest about this, I said there's nothing really wrong with just doing, say, maths from the age of 16 to 21, or history, or whatever it might be. There's nothing really wrong with it in the sense that they're all good for developing your mind. But clearly, you're not going to be making many connections outside that formal academic space if that's all you study all day long, all you're assessed on. And I think, without massive randomized controlled trials, it's fairly clear that that might be suboptimal for a lot of your future. Just one example, and I'll stop talking, Martin, let you have a word. There are still some humanities degrees you can go through at university, and you could go from 16 without ever opening an Excel spreadsheet. And I do think it's kind of weird, because you won't join any business anywhere, any enterprise anywhere, any part of government anywhere that doesn't use at least an Excel spreadsheet on some occasion. So how are you going to understand what your colleagues who work on spreadsheets are going to do? Now, we can overdo the spreadsheet thing, of course, but that's just one little example where, without really being a little bit open to things outside particular disciplines, you're just going to miss out on this kind of connected modern world.
It's a poignant example, of course, the Excel spreadsheet, because the spreadsheet became a problem, I think, in the COVID figures. The spreadsheet wasn't the right one or something like that, which then takes me to Dominic Cummings talking about the civil service not being up to scratch and too many humanities graduates there, perhaps, and not enough people who understand science. But he wanted, of course, he's past tense now, but more specialists in positions of the civil service and in government, whereas you're talking about straddling the two cultures, shall we say, of arts and sciences. Is and this takes me also towards I don't know if you've read Rebel Ideas.
No.
All right, you should read Rebel Ideas. I've forgotten the name of the guy who wrote it, but I'll put that in the link below. But Rebel Ideas talks about the need for a range of views, in all our areas of government, of business, of schooling, of everything like that, the importance of the range of ideas and what that brings to something which you perhaps wouldn't get if you have just single specialists all agreeing with each other, What I am interested in is I take what you say with the A levels. I understand that. But do you think subjects are important at secondary school, or do you think we should be modeling ourselves more on an interdisciplinary cross-curricularity, whichever we want to come down on for that term, and have more porous borders between subjects in schools?
Okay, I'll briefly answer that. Firstly, Cummings is interesting and, of course, very curious because his blog was all about educating people to get a crude grasp of the whole, as he called it, which is the great physicist Murray Gell-Mann's phrase. So Cummings himself actually thinks of himself, I think, as much more of a generalist with a crude grasp of the whole. The Odyssean project was all about an education very close, actually, to what I ended up. Well, not ended up, it's almost in parallel. I didn't know Cummings. I read that blog. I thought, wow, we're doing something very similar at UCL. So he's complicated. He wants a mixture of both kind of very high-powered generalists and, as you say, specialists. Secondly, the point I want to make is that specialization and expertise in the modern world is often interdisciplinary. This is really, really important. You're an expert because of your interdisciplinarity. Oh, is that a cat, Martin?
No, keep going.
You're an expert because of your interdisciplinarity, not in spite of it. I just want to give you one example. I could give you 20 from my students. I have a student who's just won a major international prize, finishing a PhD in civil engineering at Oxford University. So proper technical stuff, civil engineering at Oxford University. But what she does is she looks at engineering infrastructures that are implemented in island states that are trying to reduce flooding due to climate change. Stay with me. And the whole point, her expertise, is that she doesn't just look at the engineering. She looks at the anthropology, how people will use that infrastructure, the politics of it, the local political systems, how that infrastructure will get maintained, the economics, and so on. So she is in a room often of very nerdy civil engineers who've got no idea about any of this. They're working on their project. They're going to plonk it down somewhere. It'll be rusting within 6 months and never used. So she's able to say, hold on, we need to think about these other dimensions, these other aspects of the project. And that is what gives her her expertise in climate change resilience of small island states. I had another student I said I wouldn't give more than one, but they're also exciting. Another student just finished a PhD in computational cognitive neuroscience. The 3 words tell you it's interdisciplinary straight away, right? And on and on and on and on. So many modern PhDs are interdisciplinary. And the PhD is a great example because people think, oh, that's proper expertise. Yes, it is. And it's interdisciplinary. So we need to get away from the idea that you're not a specialist if you're interdisciplinary. It's the opposite in many ways. It's the most interesting, current, cutting edge specialisms which are interdisciplinary. But okay, that's at the end, that's a kind of postgrad level. When it comes to schools, I'm actually quite sympathetic, particularly secondary schools, to a bit more structure. And this is because one of the things that frustrates me about education conversations is we often fall into the talking about education as if we're talking about 5-year-olds the same as 15-year-olds, the same as 20-year-olds, and they're not the same. And they have different brain structures, they have different needs, they're going to different worlds to do things. And I do think there's probably a good argument for more structure for adolescents and more clear boundaries for all sorts of reasons than either when you're very small or when you're heading into adulthood, when you have to negotiate non-boundaries much more. So I don't really want to step too much on secondary school teachers' toes. I mean, I think, as you know, I am a fan of the IB. I think they've done a really good job in kind of helping students through those spaces, saying now you're doing your subjects and now you're doing your cross-curricularity, and that itself is a really helpful sort of cognitive hygiene process, right? And I like subjects. I mean, they've done an amazing job for 400 or 500 years. There's nothing inherently wrong with them at all. It's just that in my world that I see in university, firstly, if we get kids who are too much kind of educated in that way, they can be a bit limited. and they're unable to think creatively in other ways and make interesting connections. And secondly, as I said, almost, well, just as importantly, is the world they're going into doesn't see academic subjects, doesn't care about academic subjects, to use the Institute of Student Employers words. So why do we insist on them so much? So going back to schools, I think, there's definitely a place for careful thoughts about disciplinary teaching and making it rigorous and good, but then thinking, you know what, this is one way to do history, but a data scientist might have a completely different view of what you're doing history. Let's call in the data scientists. Let's hear about how they think about data, and let's see a dialogue with a historian. And what do the students make of that? Is there another way they could do history, which is very different to archival research or the traditional, more humanistic way of doing it? So I think both are good, basically.
Right. This is the book I was talking about, Matthew Syed.
I like him. I haven't read that one. I read his last one, Black Box Thinking.
So this is about the power of diverse thinking. So I think it's right up your street, shall we say, and would be a good one to put on the course book list, perhaps. Now, I'm interested as well. So we're talking there a bit about secondary subjects, and we said that they have some import. And think people at different ages should study different things. The IB being quite a powerful tool, perhaps more so than A levels. So we keep together some sense of subjects, but we do have that crossover from arts and sciences. We have the range there. What would be the best, though, if a student hasn't got a chance of doing the IB, as most children in England don't get a chance to do the IB, what would be the best sort of range of A levels if they wanted to prepare themselves to go to your interdisciplinary school?
Yeah, well, we would like you to be interested in arts and sciences. We think it's good for you. We think it's interesting. We think it's best for the modern world, as I've described. But we're aware of counter forces. There is a sort of traditionalist move in government, has been for many years. I think it's a kind of a panic about what the internet is doing to learning and young people in general. I think that's well founded in some ways. It's a revolution. We just don't know what's happening and going on in this experiment we're doing on humanity without any trial runs. And I also am sympathetic to some people, very well, Martin, about some aspects of teacher training, which perhaps were not the most rigorous and had a certain ideological bent and didn't allow much room for diversity of thought, actually, in their own way of thinking. So again, this is territory I'm only tangentially familiar with, but I'm sympathetic to people in that space who've suffered, if you like, under it. And so perhaps, in my view, slightly overreacted to create a very traditional view of subject boundaries, subject content. I'm absolutely staggered that my children at school, who are 13, 16, are doing more or less the same syllabus as I did 40 years ago. I mean, whether you think the world is changing or not, in half a century, this century, things have changed a bit, and it's weird that they're doing the same material. So, I'll put that one where I may, and your listeners can make of it what they will. So I think, I think breadth is great. I think it shows an interest in the world. I think if you enjoy those subjects, you should do them. There are increasingly number of places that will be very happy for you to do, say, maths, physics, and humanities, or 2 humanities and maths. And of course, if you can do 4 A levels, even better, though that's not always possible. You will find many, many courses around the country, from UCL to new universities like ours, to Birmingham, to PP, Oxford, that will look at that very favorably. But you will be having some teachers, I think, now who are anxious about this, who hear about STEM agendas driving kids to do maths, physics, and chemistry, or saying, oh, you'll never get into Oxford to do classics without doing history, Latin, and Greek. And I would be wary of those voices. I would check out with the universities themselves whether it's true, because there's so much poor information in this space. Career advice in schools. Again, forgive me if some of your listeners are on this. It seems to me terrible. I don't know any career advisors that quote the ISE regularly on that statistic I mentioned. So the students have a job, if you have any student listeners, to be very careful about the information they're getting. But for me, breadth and this acknowledgement that the world doesn't divide into arts and sciences, that it's all interesting and all part of your way that you should go forward in learning and approaching the world should lead you to think, yeah, why not? Why not take a range of arts and sciences over? It's what I want to do, and it's probably the best for my future as well.
And there's things like the EPQ, perhaps, which
Yeah, I like
might be used. What about things like hobbies and extracurricular activities and things like that as well, adding to the mix, perhaps?
Yes, I mean, as you know, I'm an aspiring veteran triathlete during lockdown, so that's my hobby at the moment. I mean, of course, you should have hobbies. I mean, it's so obvious. I don't know quite how to sort of argue for or against it, but
Well, isn't it the rumor that it's either Oxbridge perhaps don't really mind if you don't, and really sort of look for your subject specialism as the way forward?
I don't honestly know. I mean, I think the personal statement system is completely corrupt and shot. I don't know why we persist. And this is someone who has written the personal statements of many of my friends' children, right? That's what we do. They come around, they say, "Will you look at my personal statement?" You say, "Yeah, sure," and you end up writing it. Why wouldn't you? So,
You
I
mean
think
advising? You mean advising? That's
advising about that punctuation and that spelling,
yeah,
yes.
yeah.
No, it's a ridiculous system, and but the system is very hard. The whole system is difficult. The projected grades is difficult. It disadvantages underprivileged kids, as does the personal statement. So I don't have a really positive solution in that sense. So perhaps I shouldn't be too critical. I mean, I do quite like the interview system, but that also has some biases and is very onerous on resources for universities. So the hobbies thing, I mean, yeah, so the whole thing about going to university, uni and the student experience, and this might surprise people who think I'm kind of ultra progressive. I find all that a bit kind of cheesy, and like, university is about learning. It's about your mind. It's about the life of the mind, and that incredible period where you don't have obligations of finances and family, so you can literally explore yourself as a thinker and thinking being. And that should, for me, be about an intellectual transformation and journey. So great if you want to play rugby and do drama. Of course, you should do that, and some of that and will be intellectual, some of it won't. But that shouldn't be the purpose, to my mind, of going to university. You just join the local sports club to do those sorts of things. So in some ways, that might sound a bit old school. I think it's as learning as a community, sharing ideas and thoughts and viewpoints around the amazing richness which is the intellectual world, which is where university really brings its value. So I'm sort of saying I see, of course, have hobbies, great have hobbies, but I don't particularly see that as an important part of a submission to university, or even what you think you should go to university to do. You can do that stuff very well elsewhere, but you'll never have the opportunity to sit with people of a similar age from very different backgrounds, different interests, with great academics and thinkers, and the kind of world of knowledge being kind of shown to you, presented to you, critiqued with you. That just won't happen unless you have that time in life to do that.
You're talking there almost about learning for its own sake, and sounding like that might be a good thing. And yet, part of what you're talking about is preparing for the world of work as well. So how do you square those two?
Yeah, I just don't see the big boundary. And this might sound very urban, very London even, but our university at the moment is housed in a very nice space in Whitechapel called X and Y, which is also a home to tens, I think, of small social enterprises and sort of more interesting startups. And they talk all the time about purpose-driven work and well-being in work. And this generation wants this and expects it, and is increasingly trying to match their values and their interests to what they do after work. And I think we sort of still have this idea that, you go to uni and it's ivory tower and you study the great things, and then you leave and you put on a corporate tie, and you go and work some boring enterprise. You sell your soul, and again, your real life is your hobbies or your families, and you leave all that. That's totally breaking down in much of the kind of tech and internet culture and the social entrepreneurship culture. Indeed, the kind of doing well by doing good, all this stuff. And it might sound a bit privileged, but it's not the privilege which only middle class kids can have. Any kid going to university and doing the right degree now has this opportunity if they want it. They just have to be brave and take it. And many of these companies are looking for children from different backgrounds. So if you are someone from a background who just sees work as kind of either the corporate world or doctor or lawyer or engineer, don't. There are many, many other options and ways you can live your working life, which might be more interesting to you and give you a chance to keep on learning, basically. So I just don't see this very hard divide between graduate work in many instances and learning for learning's sake. I mean, so many organizations now, Martin, call themselves learning organizations, and they're looking at the best ways to give kind of learning opportunities for their people that keep their people engaged. You know, that I want to do a course in AI and ethics. Okay, great. We'll try and set that up for you. Oh, it's a bit like the master's degree I did in AI and ethics or the undergraduate degree. It's like a continuation, this lifelong learning thing. Just goes from university out into the job if you're lucky enough to get the job that you want. So yeah, I don't see a sharp divide between those two things, basically.
And this, of course, brings us to the changing world in which we find ourselves, due mainly to COVID, of course, in the short term, certainly. Are the jobs out there? Can you guarantee jobs to students who take the plunge? Is it going to be students who perhaps have family background that is stable and perhaps with a bit of money who can take that risk? Or are you open to all comers and sort of guaranteeing a job at the end of it, perhaps?
I don't think anyone can ever guarantee you a job. I have had 2 Uber drivers who studied law in the last 6 months and not at synced universities either. You may be very surprised if you do a bog standard degree at a decent university and rock up for a job and they give it to someone else who's more interesting, whose LinkedIn profile is more interesting, who can evidence that they've already done some cool stuff online. They've set up a little company, they've done some web pages. Employers are looking for people who bring more than just a degree now, a standard degree. I mean, the whole socio-political thing you raise about power and money, you know, it takes a long time to unwind. But, you know, Oxbridge have made some bold moves there recently, haven't they? They reduced the number of private school kids I think they would take. They actually sort of put a quota on it. And, you know, these things are moving in that kind of direction. Diversity is a big thing in employment now. And so, again, alongside ideas, I think, you know, are you diverse in mind as well as maybe what your background is? If you've done a standard degree, a standard university, you may not be as diverse as you think, and you may not be as interesting as you think. So there are risks on both sides. I think that's the thing I want to take, want to say. If you go to London Interdisciplinary School, you will have all the skill sets and all the knowledge which any modern employer would want. We also will have many, I mean, tens, possibly hundreds by the time we launch, of employer contacts, internship opportunities, project opportunities. So I'm enjoying this. I mean, the university is started by a couple of people with tech backgrounds who've done their own companies, and Ed, who you know is an education guy, but a sort of entrepreneurial education guy. So there's a real culture within us of meeting business, reaching out to enterprises of all sorts, public, private, social good, and so on, and introducing students to those environments. So that's how it works these days. It works through you as a student making contact with people, evidencing that you are the sort of person they want through some project work or some internships, and then the job happens. It's less and less about old school tie and kind of blue chip undergraduate degree, although of course, you know, power and money will always talk. Yeah.
You've made me want to check my LinkedIn profile and perhaps doing a YouTube channel. That should look good, shouldn't it, for the modern age? Perhaps, you know, that puts me into the entrepreneurial bracket, I think. You mentioned some names of who are working with you on this venture. There's a name you haven't mentioned yet who might be of interest to our viewers out there, and that's Daisy Christodoulou. Can you tell me a bit about her work with your organization?
Yeah, so Daisy's very much been a consultant. She's not part of the core team, but she's someone we value enormously. I respect her enormously. Some of the most lively conversations about education I've ever had. There are not that many. I've been with Daisy over the last year or so. It's interesting because sometimes we seem to disagree very strongly about, for example, the knowledge core of education. And sometimes we realize that after some refinements, we're actually talking about the same thing from slightly different perspectives. And I think it is sometimes the school university perspective which we differ on. And then we realize that we're meeting in the middle. She, I think, knows Ed quite well from previous work. And she's just brilliant. I mean, she's brilliant at holding us to account about the knowledge core of what we're doing, about assessment. We're both very interested in the learning sciences. So the Make It Stick book, to the sort of update, the recent one, Scott Young, Ultra Learners. And we want to respect that in our learning at university. I personally don't think that universities think enough about the learning sciences and the way they deliver the curriculum. So the standard 1 hour lecture and the way things are assessed and so on. So we're looking much more at, well, interleaving actually itself, you know, the idea that not drilling one thing exclusively for a long time and then another, but actually interleaving different things. You could argue that interdisciplinarity is kind of high level cognitive interleaving itself of a conceptual sort, you know, jumping from data science to history to something in the laboratory requires your mind to shift a lot, and then going back to it, you might have a kind of enhanced understanding, analogously to someone in sports practicing different strokes in an interleaving way. Difficult to prove, but interestingly, my very brilliant neuroscience colleague at UCL, Professor Ben Walsh, thought that was quite a suggestive idea, that our students at UCL were sort of interleaving intellectual, conceptual things all the time that had a gain greater than the sum of its parts. So Daisy's just fantastic on all these things. She's an expert now, self-taught, but very, very high-level expert in the learning sciences, in many of these debates around education. So she's helped us with the curriculum on things like assessment and knowledge content. And I hope we continue that relationship. I believe we're still very much working together, and we'll be in touch with us soon, I think, about perhaps using comparative judgment on some of our more humanistic assessments.
So one of the things there about sports, and is a sports person, or do they specialize in certain sports? And are you going to get sort of never the best tennis player if they do badminton, tennis, squash, football, rugby, etc., or focus on the one thing?
So I've got to wave a book at you now.
That range, okay, yeah.
The first chapter is called Roger or Tiger, and it's about Tiger Woods, who from the age of 3 was strapped to a golf club and became very great, but perhaps had some issues along the way, and Roger Federer, who was playing football till the age of 15 and wasn't quite sure what sport he wanted to go into. So this book makes the case. I think it's probably backwards because my camera might be.
No, it's okay. It's okay for us.
It makes the case that at least for a whole chunk of people, whether it's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50%, I don't know, but many more than get the opportunity at the moment, those people need to have range throughout their education. They need to try different things, learn more in parallel than in theory, so different things at the same time, rather than one thing after another. All the stuff we're talking about, and I love this book. I mean, David was kind enough to be in touch with me when I was writing my obscure little blog back at UCL about generalism and dilettantism and all those things, and he's now really done some amazing research. This is a beautiful book, very well researched on all these kinds of issues. That, you know, there's another way to think about getting expertise and deep learning over a period of time, and one is to keep this breadth and this cross-fertilization and cross-curricularity, if you like, all the way. So yeah, I think there are just different ways of arriving at that excellence in whatever you do.
Yeah, and before we reach the end, because we're coming up to the end now. I've really enjoyed this, by the way. It's good to talk to you again. Your name, sir. People might look at your name and think, that's an interesting name. Where have I heard that before? Can you tell me your progeny? Where are you from? What have you brought into the world? Name. People recognize the name. Talking about cross-disciplinarity, interdisciplinarity. Sorry, where there's certain levels of the I've forgotten the name of the book now. An arts book and a history book.
Yeah, so my granddad Gombrich was a very great academic. Ernst Gombrich. He wrote a book called The Story of Art, which is the best-selling introduction to art history of all time. And very interestingly, he was a very great interdisciplinarian, but the word wasn't used at that time, and actually kind of was more in line with the things that I think you're interested in, and that's a classic idea of a liberal education in which you just sort of combine things because they're interesting and come up with interesting ideas. And he did that in a very uniquely brilliant and interesting way. But I remember talking to a Cambridge academic not that long ago now, about 10 years ago, about my granddad, who was an art historian and educated in the classics, really. And this guy said to me, you know, I think your granddad was a really great psychologist and actually contributed greatly to the field of psychology. And my granddad never studied psychology. He went to, I think, one lecture by a great psychologist in Berlin. But it was all sort of self-taught, and because he was a kind of liberal-minded Bildung, that's the European phrase for liberal arts, kind of a guy. So yeah, and I love that. So obviously, I'm never going to be as great as him, and that's all fine and appropriate. But he remains a great inspiration for me as a sort of someone who was brave and eclectic about pulling together different ideas in order to make something that was coherent and really valuable in his space, which was the history of art. So yeah, I mean, I'm not. It wasn't a very posh background, Martin, as you know, but I mean, well, not rich, but maybe intellectually posh, because Dad's also a very great academic at Oxford. He's a Sanskritist and Indologist. So it's a very academic family. And in that sense, it was very rich and culturally rich without being necessarily, whereas I didn't go to public school or anything like that. So it was, yeah, now looking back, I mean, I had a very tortuous route to where I am now, but certainly that kind of heritage and breadth of interest in my family is now immensely valuable to me and something I appreciate enormously in the last 10 years. What I was able to, well, I didn't draw on it consciously. You don't when you're 13, right? You want to play football, rock and roll, and get the girl, but it was all around me clearly, and has very much informed the way I see the world and what I'd like to do in education now.
I'm not going to pursue the questions about rock and roll and the girl and all that, but you have shaken the hand of Karl Popper.
Much more than that. I mean, Karl Popper was my granddad's best friend, and they spoke every day, I think, on the phone in their 80s and 90s, and he had very sweet conversations. Two ancient Viennese men, they're both eminent scholars sort of in the world, and it was just lovely to hear. There was one lovely conversation. You may need to edit this out. We're rambling on too long now.
No, go.
Popper said to my granddad, Ernst, Ernst, I want to write something about art. Should I write about art? And my granddad, who had a similar accent but a very strong lisp, said, no, Karl, you don't know anything about art. So, I mean, my dad knew Popper very well, and he's also very influenced by him and his academic work. I mean, I was very young, of course, so I probably met Popper maybe somewhere between 10 and 20 times in my life, but he was very, very close to my parents and my grandparents, sorry. So we did meet him at things like his birthdays and my grandparents' birthdays. So I had many conversations with him, and yeah, I was very fond of him. He was a very, very charismatic person in a way, though also very frightening. And there was one occasion towards the end of his life, actually, where I thought he was a bit out of order with me. I was just discovering kind of philosophy for myself. I was pretty young, though. I was maybe reading my first ever book on things like that. So I was probably 14 or 15. And yeah, I got in some discussion with him about philosophy of science, and I don't think he was very generous to me as a 15-year-old. He was really kind of vicious and kind of dismissing my idea, which I later found out actually was the same idea that Duhem has had about you can always save the hypothesis, save the theory by adding another piece of evidence, if you like, from a different way of looking at the world. I think it's the Quine, Duhem, somebody else theory of philosophy of science. So, you know, I wasn't being thick or stupid. It's just that Popper was very, very didactic. And some of your listeners may know, if they've read biographies of him and his LSE behavior, he was vicious in some academic circles in that way of defending academic territory, kind of beyond the way we'd think was acceptable now, actually. You'd probably get done for bullying now if you were Karl Popper, which is quite interesting. But yeah, he was very close to family. And there are lots of lovely stories about, there's the stewed apple story where he came to a birthday party, probably my granddad's, and my granddad's favorite food was stewed apple. And Karl Popper must have had stewed apple many times before in his life. But anyway, he sat down and my granny had made stewed apple, and they were eating it. And he just looked up at one point and said, "Ilse, this is delicious. What is it?" She said, "Stewed apple, Karl." Oh, lovely. Anyway,
do you think he was right on what's about science?
Do I think he was right? Not, I mean, not entirely, no. I think it's more complicated than that. I mean, I think he did, so a couple of things he did, but I think are really important we hold on to in this age of postmodernism and the kind of vanishing of holding on to truth or reality or facts, if you like. And I think falsification is a really important idea, that arguments have to have some way of being falsified, otherwise they're hardly worth putting forward. But I think when you dig very deep into what falsification is, it gets very complicated, and that's the kind of quiet and do them thing, I think. And this other idea is talked about less. There's actually a YouTube video. I'm going to talk to my granddad about this, about kind of better knowledge, about improving in knowledge. It's also kind of related to falsification, that you weed out bad stuff as you go along and think your knowledge gets better and better in some way. I think that's also really important. Otherwise, everything's kind of nihilistic and there's no idea of progress. But of course, both those ideas are kind of Whiggish in the sense that they kind of want to acknowledge progress. And of course, Popper and my grandfather, as kind of survivors of Nazism and the Second World War in different ways, had a very personal and subtle but important view on progress. On the one hand, they saw how society could slip back into the worst kind of barbarism and evil at the drop of a hat, but also how it could then pull itself out and kind of go forward. So you could be surprised that they thought progress was a thing and a good thing and happening because of their experiences, but they did, and they did really believe in the Enlightenment values, despite the fact that Germany, kind of tilted those values on their head and became this horrible Nazi state. They did believe in the power of science to do well, the power of reason, and this idea of better knowledge, therefore, being a possibility and being something we should aim for, I think is very important. And you look at so many parts of the world now, whether it's on the right or on the left, people seem to give that up for various reasons. And so that's scary. And I think I believe Popper was right to hold to those values. And I just hope most of the world is able to benefit from those values, because I think the alternatives are just not as good, basically.
Do you know what, Karl? I think we're only just getting going, really. We can speak like this all day, but we are reaching, or have reached, in fact, the end of our time together. It's I wish you luck with this venture. I hope it's a great success and goes from strength to strength, and you get some interesting students in, and without maybe taking exams, even the first lot coming through. We haven't even thought about that, really, have we?
No, thank you, Marty. Can I say you've been a very good listener and interview. I'm sorry if I didn't make it much of a conversation. You're the sort of new Joe Rogan of educational podcasts. So I wish you well in this venture and many views and all that. Yeah, we'll do it again sometime. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Take care.
Cheers. Bye-bye.